Welcome to Class 4. We will be focusing on the library reference model, and we'll be talking about that through the lens of subject analysis. Welcome. You've almost made it completely through this class. I will be teaching Dewey next month, so if you're interested in participating in another class with me, feel free to join me for that. Class activities will be much the same actually coming up, as well as for the remainder of this session. For the Dewey, we'll have more exercise sorts of things to do, but for this session, we've had a lot more sort of weekly discussions, and we've had a lot more in terms of quizzes and exercise and writings and things like that, because this particular topic is a good place to take a moment to kind of reflect on what we do. We won't be going through too many examples today in terms of actual controlled vocabularies, but as always, we will be looking at a few, and those will be Library of Congress subject headings. We are here, so just about at the end of this class, we're going to talk about the user task for subject analysis as outlined in the library reference model. But before we do that, we'll actually talk about what the library reference model is and why it's so important. Just a quick review, and I hope this is something that you take with you as you go forward and you sort of look at your work, or maybe you're working on institutional repositories or digital library projects, thinking about the role of the controlled vocabulary. And we've looked at and talked about controlled vocabularies and really looked at the Library of Congress subject headings through a microscope. But I hope that you will take that process where we looked at the Library of Congress subject headings and really thought about the structure of them and talked about where there's a bias and sort of the history of that controlled vocabulary. And I hope you kind of take that with you as you look at other controlled vocabularies that you may be working with. Of course, there are many other controlled vocabularies besides the Library of Congress subject headings. There's the medical subject headings. There's also Sears. There's so many more. If you go out and look in the metadata registries or really numerous resources, you'll just find there's so many controlled vocabularies out there. Of course, we know the difference between a subject heading and a keyword in terms of how they work within our ILSs, within our integrated library systems. But this is something that I hope that you have a better understanding of and can communicate this to your colleagues and then your maybe public service peers and other folks that you may come into contact with. Because I think sometimes, especially when we think about Google and we want a Google experience, but what people don't really sometimes think about is in a Google experience, you kind of get just sort of everything, and Google does sort of a weird relevance ranking, and then there's the whole thing about whoever pays the most through advertising funds and things like that gets higher ranking in Google anyway. So, we want to be able to provide information that is relevant in a more neutral fashion. And regardless what Google may say, and I'm not trying to bash on Google, but regardless what Google may say about, providing relevance ranking, any of us knows that if you just go out and you search something that's a very general term, you may not find exactly what you're looking for on even the first page sometimes. Sometimes we have to page through a couple of pages, or we may go back and refine our search because what we are actually looking for is so far down in the search results. So, there's lots of good things about the Google search experience, but one thing that we can do with subject headings, because we have this ability to create sort of connections and links and relationships between related terms and people and the content they write and things like that, we have the opportunity to create a more precise search. And so how can we sort of communicate that? Of course, the process, we talk quite a bit about what the process of subject analysis is. That is the process of assigning, and for the kind of work we do, it goes a little bit beyond just selecting. It's actually a selecting and then recording the process. So, and because most of us or many of us work in MARC records, the recording process then includes how do you format that in a MARC record, what indicators do you use, what subfields do you use, all of that kind of information. So for what we think of in terms of subject analysis, it sometimes get merged in with that MARC aspect of it, because it's not just we're going to figure out which subject heading is the best and which subfield which subject heading and which subdivision is the best. It also may be that we're thinking about it in terms of what our subfields are going to be. So, we're thinking about things like, what is it about, that aboutness at the most general level, but then we're also thinking about it in terms of what the form and the genre and the format, and then we're looking at how we're going to translate that decision, that aboutness, into a particular subject heading system. And that is probably, that part of it's the piece that is so hard to kind of teach or explain, because there's a lot of cataloger judgment, there's research that goes into that process, there's investigation, there's interpretation of the information that's presented to you, and all of that goes into this process, then that analysis of that, which then goes into choosing from a particular subject heading system. So use the most specific information, most specific term applicable. We've talked about this before. If you have a work on systems librarian, if you look and systems librarian is in your thesaurus, then you should use that, not something more general. So we've looked at this example before and talked about this example before, not only in terms of specific, the specificity of it. I'm just going to be tongue-tied tonight. We're also talking about looking at what the basic principles of subject analysis for any subject heading system. So really that sort of that internal process of kind of thinking about what an item is about. And so the Library of Congress, the Library of Congress subject headings, they've given us some guidance. You're looking at the work as a whole, which is probably going to be accurate for most controlled vocabularies. But if you're in another controlled vocabulary or doing a different kind of cataloging, you're doing more special collections, more archival cataloging, you may follow different principles in terms of that. But in terms of sort of standard cataloging, where you're just going to catalog, you're going to use the Library of Congress subject headings, you're following RDA, just sort of the basics. The Library of Congress has given us guidelines in terms of how to determine what it's about. So looking at, as a whole, what is it about? And then if we have more topics or less topics, then how do we deal with that? So, and then they've given us guidance about how many to add. Typically, at least one. And of course, serials a lot of times falls into the one category, but at least one. Other things that are more general would fall into the one category too. And then up to 6. And sort of 6 is sort of their limit, but they kind of give you an out that if you need to go up to 10, you can. But 10 sort of the hard and fast limit for the Library of Congress guidelines. Now, does that mean that you are limited in terms of what you can do, that you want to do more than 10? If you are in a library that has time to support more than 10 and you want to do more than 10, then that's sort of your decision in terms of deviating from that policy. Having cataloged for following the Library of Congress rules, there were times when we were given exceptions when we could go more than 10. So, even within their own framework, sometimes things go outside. There are the exceptions. And so, of course, we're also looking at, the resources and the tools that are available to us. So determining what that subject content is, we've already talked about these, but you're really going to look at anything that's available to you. If it may be, if you're cataloging for people who work in the CIP, the cataloging and publication project, they're actually doing their subject analysis based upon the summary and what the publisher is providing to them. So, depending on where you're getting your information, depending on what your cataloging source is, you may have more or less of this. So, you're going to look at the title, certainly. You're going to look at the table of contents. You're going to look at a summary. You may look at information you find on the publisher's website as sort of a supplementary information. If you're doing archival cataloging, then that means you may be looking at finding aids or other documented information about your particular resource, especially if you start dealing with things like visual arts and three-dimensional materials and things like that. So, you start looking at things like furniture and other stuff like that, you're probably going to spend a significant time doing some investigation outside of how that piece presents itself, because you're not going to have sort of the whole story of that particular piece without doing that investigation. So different types of cataloging, different formats of cataloging will require you to look at different materials and may do more additional research outside. But all of these are good places to look. So types of concepts to identify, topics, that would be our subjects, and then names, person, corporate bodies, geographic areas, time periods. We talked a little bit about time periods last week, and we're actually going to talk a lot more about sort of where time periods fit in things these days, titles of work, and then form of the item. Subjects versus genres and forms. So subject, what the item is about, and then form, what the item is, rather than what it is about. And then genre is where we get to like works with a common theme or setting, uh, really just get to that way of trying to pull together things like, mystery fiction or comedy films, or things that people are searching for that we don't really have a way to get to it. Now, as we've seen from our discussions and some of our readings and things like that, form is one of those things where there's a little bit of overlap between form and form subdivisions. And so this is one of those areas going forward that we're probably going to see not only some clarification, but we may even see some changes in how form subdivision work versus an actual form subject heading. Order subject headings. The first subject heading should reflect the primary topic. And for the Library of Congress subject headings, if you are working with either the Library of Congress classification or you're working with the Dewey classification, then that would generally correspond to the assigned call number range. And then, of course, the other ones should fall in descending order of importance, but that gets real murky sometimes. But the first one is really the most important. After that, in terms of how they kind of fall into place, that, like I said, that's a little bit more murky in terms of you can't always say like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's just not always going to work that way. One, you can usually figure out like what's the most important, and then the others, 2, 3, whatever, those may all be more equivalent, and there's really nothing you can do except just kind of put them in some sort of order without really even considering a ranking. Categories of subdivisions, we talked about these already, but just to kind of review here quickly, there's 4 categories of subdivision. So topical, that's your subfield X, form, your subfield V, chronological is Y, and geographic is Z. And so those are MARC subdivision codes. 650, this would be in our MARC, when we're looking at a MARC field. That's where we put our topical term. And then the indicators, and we talked much more about this, so we're just sort of reviewing for this time. The indicators, first indicator's blank, that can be denoted as this funky B or a pound sign. And then our second indicator really tells us like where that authority is coming from. Are we using a Library of Congress subject heading? Are we using a MESH, National Library of Medicine subject heading? And if so, we're going to use the correct indicator to correspond to the term we're using. This is a sort of an older practice, I feel, because when you look at RDA records, you'll notice that in a lot of fields, there's a subfield 2 that just defines what either controlled vocabulary or what list that may come from. And so I kind of think, I'm kind of wondering if this indicator thing will eventually go away, and we'll just use a subfield 2 to say like, Library of Congress subject headings, or subfield 2 children's literature. Will it go away before we move to something else before, before we get out of MARC? I don't know. Maybe we just continue this kind of mixed approach where for the newer fields, they're defined with a subfield 2 that tells you then, so one field, but then the subfield 2 tells you what controlled vocabulary it is. And maybe we continue with that approach for some fields, and then we'll just keep these older fields as they are for now until we get out of MARC at some point in the future. Some examples. We're not going to spend too much time on examples. You've had plenty of examples to look at. 651, geographic names. So this is really where we put our place names. And we talked quite a bit about places and topics in the last couple of classes. So we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about this. We're just kind of reviewing as we go through. 655, that's where our genre terms go. And there's that subfield 2 for the source of the term. So in theory, we can, as you can see here, we put not only our genre, but we put our form terms in there as well. So, and there's, there's other terms that we can put in there using that subfield 2. So that's the approach that is a more recent development, that we use the same field and then we just define it with that subfield 2 at the end. And that's a much more modern practice, and then it doesn't really rely on this indicator kind of thing. This is also something that can be more easily translated to a non-MARC record. So for a MARC record where you have indicators in place, you have to find some place in a non-MARC record to communicate that same information. Here we would just have the subfield 2, and that could be actually communicated much more easily as even a subdivision within that. So it's a little bit in terms of like coding like a Dublin Core record or coding something that's a non-MARC record. It's a little bit easier to do a subfield versus indicators, because a lot of other ways of expressing bibliographic information will have sort of subcategories and the ability to have sort of this nested approach in terms of how the data is structured. So getting us to where we were going to talk about today, the library reference model. So, we've talked a lot about sort of the more current practices and sort of thinking a little bit about the future. So we've talked a little bit about linked data. We've talked a little bit about what do we do with events and how that's a little bit murky. We've talked a little bit about how our controlled vocabulary is kind of outdated, but we're kind of looking at ways to reach out to those other communities, and we're kind of looking at ways to address some of this, some of the issues with our controlled vocabularies being outdated, and also to see how we can, within our own records, what we can do to kind of address some of that too. So those are all kind of things that are happening sort of, as we go about our daily practice when we're cataloging all those things. You have to figure out how you're going to code it. Well, first you have to figure out what your subject is. That's the first thing I guess you have to figure out. First thing you figure out to, what is your item that you're cataloging about that, and then the next parts of it are kind of thinking about that subject heading, thinking about those, that structure of the controlled vocabulary, where your topic falls in it and all of that. And then also thinking about, do you want to use something like the Library of Congress thesaurus, the demographic terms, or do you want to use, if you're doing music, the music terms? Do you want to make that choice? And if so, how do you go about including that in your records? But, in the last, at least for most libraries, somewhere around 2013-ish was really when RDA implementation really took off. Now, there are certainly libraries who implemented RDA much earlier than that. And, there's some libraries that are still slowly implementing RDA. So I think depends on how you came into RDA. If you came into RDA and you did a lot of foundational work where you really looked at Ferber and Fred and Freesat, and you spent a lot of time looking at those, then these conceptual models that inform RDA, inform our guidelines, are something that's probably very much part of your mindset in terms of how you look at things in RDA. If you came to RDA from a more practical, like how do I catalog this thing, and you didn't spend a lot of time with these three models, then this may feel like a little bit of a shift. And I think it is a shift in a couple of ways. It is a shift in terms of, or a continuing shift in terms of thinking about our data in that bigger picture, and thinking about our data in terms of how can the machine and the human work together to make sure that our users can find what they need. And of course, as we talked about in session 2, we talked a little bit too about how can what do we do in terms of our creators? And we hadn't really thought about that role, librarian, cataloger as stewards of data versus scribes of data. So, there's a lot of interesting things happening in terms of that. But, thinking about sort of where we've come in the last few years and how how did we get there? And it really started with this vision of these 3 models. And the first one, of course, being FRBR, which is Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Records. And I know that you've already looked at some of the FRBR stuff, and so we've talked a little bit about FRBR already. And then FRAD being the same sort of thing, but for authority data. And then the last one, which has never really been finished, is the FRESAD, as we all seem to mangle this acronym, and that's Functional Requirements for Subject Authority Data. And one thing that I want you to just look at, just in those 3 acronyms, is that we have, something parallel here. We have functional requirements. So, how do we want these things to work? And in this first one, we have bibliographic records. So we're talking about a record. And then when it comes to authorities, we're talking about data, although we know there are authority records. And the same thing with our subjects. We know there's authority records for subjects as well. There's subject authority records. So even just in how we've named these 3, there's some inconsistencies between the 3 models. Now, FRBR is really the heart of what has driven most of the changes with RDA. Names, we've had some changes with names, but really FRBR was like sort of the big launch, the big reveal that just really impacted so much how we change things. Because with FRBR was things like, it really started looking at how we were creating information, how we were creating that bibliographic information. And the authority data really sort of came, it was sort of informed in some ways by FRBR. So they're 3 separate models. They're sort of considered to be equal models, so they're not a hierarchy. But at the same time, when you look at how FRBR then impacts FRAD, the authority data, it's hard not to think that, well, there's more of an impact. And that would be true for the subject authority data too. So there were 3 models that were very distinct, and you can see just from even the names, they're not parallel in terms of how they're considered. Because we didn't call it FRBA, we could have called it, or FRBAD, we could have called it Functional Requirements for Bibliographic Data, or FRBAD, so we could have called it something like that. But so we're, kind of looking at it from different ways. But those were really the early conceptual foundations for RDA, for that resource description and access. And it looks kind of like something like this. And really what I want you to kind of take away, and you'll have time to spend as much time with this as you want. This is not my model, but this is one that's been kicking around for a long time. But there were 3 distinct things going on. So you had what we called our WIMI, Work, Expression, Manifestation, and Item. And they also called this the Group 1 entities. So this is FRBR right here. You had down here Person, Family, Corporate Body, FRAD. So that was FRAD. And we'll talk a little bit, we'll look at this model in a different way in just a minute. And then you had down here the functional requirements of subject authority data. Now what I want you to look at is all the connections and relationships between everything. So everything up here can be a subject, which is true, right? A title can be a subject. If you're writing a book about Winnie the Pooh, then, that is whatever the name of the first Winnie the Pooh book is, that is the title. So that's what it's the subject of. If you're writing it as a biography of Winnie the Pooh, then, Winnie the Pooh would be your subject. And then, of course, you could be writing something else about it. So, something about um, Christopher Robin or whatever it could be, something about the place, the history of Winnie the Pooh, whatever. Um, but anyway, so you have other things that can be subjects. But really what I have always found when you actually take some time and work through this is it's very easy to see, here's your Ferber stuff, here's your Frad stuff, and here's your Freesat. Now I've added the red, so this is me. But the other thing you can look at is all of these lines and relationships, how everything works together. And so this is sort of the idea, except when you notice down here, the subject authority data, it's in some way kind of isolated because we really hadn't ever finished this part out. So we didn't really completely work it back into the model. The other thing I want you to notice is when you look at that FreeSAD down there, we are identifying place. So that makes sense, right? Geographic place, we've got that, right? Event. So we're going to actually try to get a handle on events, do them a little bit better than that sort of hodgepodge that we looked at. And then we have object. So objects is a little bit of an interesting one. And then we have concept, which concept is a really hard thing to define. And so that one has been a little bit challenging. Here's another example of that. And I've added some things in here to kind of illustrate exactly what it is. So we have again our WIMI, our work expression manifestation item. Most of us catalog here on the manifestation level. Um, there are some people who are creating these work and expression records, and if you are cataloging a different edition, then you may add a link to another expression or another work to create a link to that other record. And so that's, even though you're not creating a work or expression level record by linking to that other edition, it's creating sort of that work connection. And relationships are something that we are going to continue to look at. So it's not just a relationship between a subject and a particular title. It's not just a relationship of the person or the author or the creator to a particular title. It's not just the relationship, um, you know, of the title to something else. It can also be the relationships between a title to a title, like an addition to the original or a translation to an original. So those relationships, sort of internal relationships almost, those are part of this too. So one of the things I like about this particular diagram is because it's very easy to see that every single part of these three models has relationships, and relationships exist between everything. So has as subject, has a subject, has a subject. So basically anything can be a subject, and we know that to be true from what we've looked at. You can have titles that are subject, peoples that are subjects, topics that are subject. So, this was sort of where we were going, but three models working sort of together but not entirely. I think there's a lot more to kind of think about the three models if you're a person who's really spent some time with them, to kind of think about them and really think about where they don't work, and then think about sort of the largest semantic web and how data is more fluid and there's linking between everything. And there's also some discussion about, do we need an authority and a bib, do we need authority data, an authority record, and a bib record? Like, can that data coexist? So I think as we're starting to think about data being more fluid, having three sort of buckets feels a little bit restricting, I think. But anyway, it's something to kind of think about. So, part of what we were doing with looking at those three models was thinking about what is our work and why do we do it. And so when they started kind of looking at these three models, it was kind of like, well, is this really going to work for us? Do we really need three models? And then the other part of it, I think, was really being struggled with, are we ever going to be able to finish the subject authority data? And so, you know, sort of that gazing into the sunset. Are we ever going to get this thing done before something else comes along? And so, there are those three frameworks. I've kind of just summed them up real quickly from all the diagrams there. You have group one, what they actually called them groups at one point. Group one, that was your Ferber. So that was your products of intellectual or artistic endeavor. So that's where you get your WIMI, your work expression manifestation item. Group two, that's functional requirements of authority data, responsible for the content production or custodianship of group one. So, those things that we get on our desk to catalog, whoever is the person, or it could be a group of people working together or family. So, who's responsible for it? Who made it? Who created it? Or who put it together? Who edited it? Who curated it? And then, of course, group three is um, it's the subject headings, but so it's the subjects of what's in that group one. So group one being, that's our product. So that could be a book, it could be a digital object, it could be a couch, it could be whatever it is that we're collecting. So that product we have, it could be, political papers, posters, letters, letters from a family. It can be any of those things. So those products, so the subject of those products, and then because it's a subject, it can include kind of anything. So then it could be the people. So, you have a periodical about a family, by a family. Well, it's going to be both by a family and about a family now. And then, of course, it includes also other subjects. So you can have something that's kind of written about a person, written about a title, uh, really almost all kinds of relationships that we can have. And so then it started trying to define concept, object, event, and place. So basically, just about everything can be a subject. So when we look at group three, that is really where we're sort of looking at it in terms of how it all works together. So just remember concept, object, event, and place, because that's what we started with in terms of thinking about subjects. We also were looking at subjects in sort of this very rigid framework where they are sort of by themselves in their own group. So then IFLA, and that is the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. And I will not say IFLA again, probably after that, because we're going to be just talking about the Learning Library Reference Model. They got together, there's a group that got together and they wanted to look at those three models. And so, the goal was to resolve the inconsistencies, but I think there were some other goals that were, sort of part of it too. I mean, that's sort of like the elevator pitch, right? We're just going to resolve the inconsistencies between three separate models. But there was much more to it, kind of looking to the future, like data is more portable. Do we have to have data that's so structured? Can data be more fluid? All those kinds of things are all sort of part of this awareness of how the world has changed, even since 2013. So what they came up with is a single model and looking at having a more consistent model. So looking at how the hierarchy was developed. And so you remember when we've looked at WIMI, it's kind of a hierarchy where you have work and then expression, manifestation, items. So it's a hierarchy there. But then when you look at authorities, they're not a hierarchy. And we're going to look at examples and talk about it more. And then the other part of it, and this is getting to that awareness of the future, is it's designed to work in a linked data environment. So this is probably these two things together. Like, we just don't need three models. It's just too much, and the data is not that separated all the time. We have authority data that links or works with bib records. Same thing with the subject authority data, and we separated out subjects and names. So we separated them out in terms of these three models, and in fact, they could have been just one giant bucket of authority data if we wanted to go that direction. So we got out our eraser and we said, out. The three models are gone. They are no more. We did keep most of FreeSAD. they say place and time span are new entities, but of course we already had place, but we sort of revised it in terms of how we've just defined place. So place is really repurposed. If you hear somebody say like, oh, place and time span are new, place is not really new. We already had that under FreeSat. It's just been repurposed and sort of redefined. It is still evolving. So everything that we talk about tonight is very much in the process of evolving. What stays? This is helpful to know. WIMI as a hierarchy, work at the top, item at the bottom, stays. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this when you actually look at some of the documentation, because this is one of the things that um, is a little bit confusing. So we'll talk about authorities stay, but they have different terms and they now have a hierarchy. So we'll talk about that. RDA, well, what it will do is it's going to inform RDA. So if you have access to the new RDA toolkit, if you've been looking in the new RDA toolkit and you see all these terms, and you're like, what is going on? This is what's going on. The library reference model has already been incorporated into the new toolkit. So that's why you see these terms we're going to be talking about. What else stays the same? The concept of bibliographic and authority data. So subject and name stays the same. The concept of bibliographic data kind of stays the same. So remember, Ferber did not tell us how to catalog. It was just like the framework for what our records were supposed to achieve. So this is the same sort of thing. It's not actually going to tell you what information you need to put into which field. It's not going to tell you which subject you're going to use. It's just going to tell you how that data is structured, like how should it work at the most theoretical levels. So the things we're talking about today will be more theoretical because this is not the RDA rules for how this will work. This is just how the structure, the framework defines things. The terminology is more in line with semantic web communities. The Ferber user task still there, but a little bit different. And then as part of developing this hierarchy, there's two things that you'll see when you're looking at documentation about the LRM. You'll see res mentioned a lot, and we're going to talk about res. Um, res is a superclass, and we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. And then you'll see the words super and sub a lot of times. So you'll see class and super. Uh, subclass, superclass. So super higher, sub lower. But there's getting to your hierarchy right there. Class is just a group. And so in terms of like data structures and other kind of data modeling, it means a little bit more than that. But just for the purposes of what we're talking about today, to sort of simplify it, you just think of class as like a group. So, you know, we had Ferber, that's the functional requirements, bibliographic records, the two supporting frameworks, which were still evolving, but did not really get finished. And one of the things that those models were meant to do is to allow the development of more relationships between records. And so, you know, we've talked a lot about relationships, but this is really kind of thinking about it a little bit more. And because of those inconsistencies between the model, we did just sort of think like, okay, maybe we need to do something different. So a few things to sort of point out in terms of highlights, what I call highlights. The terminology changes for authorities. It does align more with the semantic web communities. And so instead of, you still have person, you still have corporate body. I kind of think corporate body may go at some point because it doesn't make a lot of, doesn't really say, it doesn't really explain what it is. I mean, it's a little bit misleading, I think. So I think I wouldn't be surprised to see corporate body go in the future. Uh, but then we have families, and I think families will stay in terms of a group. But then on top of that, we also have agent for singular. So we have person and agent, and then we have collective agent. We're going to look at these in just a minute. Collective agent, which is both corporate bodies and families, so all groups. Subjects, again, we're adding that addition of time span, and that is much more in line with other metadata communities. We've really not been able to do much with time span. in our records, and we try to capture it where we can by using like chronological subdivisions, but we just really haven't been able to, or sometimes if the resource is just about a particular time period, we'll use it as a subject heading, but we really don't have a good place to really capture time span. And we really haven't defined exactly how to deal with time span. So that's another area where as going forward and we are developing, we look at this definition of time span that we can now use, and we look at then what does that mean in terms of RDA? What does that mean in terms of subject analysis? Does that mean that we continue to use chronological subdivisions and we just say that's our time span? Or does it mean that we actually have some kind of new heading to incorporate time span in a different way? So, this hasn't quite shaken out in terms of exactly how we're going to do this, except we now kind of have this new category that we can figure out. So the previous three frameworks are mostly folded in. There's bits of it kind of folded in. Terminologies change kind of in spots all across it, and we're going to look at some of it in a minute. And then it adds explore to the Ferber user task. So we'll talk more about that in a minute, but we've talked a little bit about the serendipity and people being able to find things in different ways. And that's really what it's trying to get to. And I think this is one of those areas where ILSs have just not been able to provide a good user experience. If you go to a library and you just kind of walk around, or maybe you go to pick something off the shelf and you look and you're like, oh, I see something over there, or I'm going to go over there. That sort of wandering. And we do it on the web. You search for something in Google, and before you know it, you're watching a cat riding a Roomba. It's just that serendipity of discovery. And we don't have a way to really do that so well in our catalogs. And not just lead people down someplace that is completely maybe irrelevant to what they're looking for, but we're very structured. We lead them directly either up or down the hierarchy, or maybe we lead them to related things, or maybe they look for things by other authors, but it's not as much of a serendipity of a discovery experience. So RDA, one of the things RDA did was that we talked a lot more about relationships. That was kind of a biggie, where he just started talking more about relationships, not only the relationship that a particular author or creator might have to the work, but defining that relationship. So, defining that person as the author, or other kinds of relationships that people may have to a work. All the people who perform and take part in the production of a movie, being able to define and express their role. So we spend a lot of time kind of looking at relationships, and I think that's all great that we're kind of going in that direction. But one of the things that the library reference model does is it sort of updates the terminology a little bit. So it defines that in a relationship, so this is the library reference model of a relationship, it is a specific association between two RDA entities, and this is formally known as relationship designators, or relator. I think you could even call them relator codes, because in terms of a MARC record, it's a relator code. I think we'll probably all still call it that, but they have defined it a little bit differently. And notice the RDA entities. We're going to talk about that in just a minute, because you're going to start seeing that terminology throughout the RDA toolkit and other things that you may be looking at. So an attribute is a characteristic, and a characteristic can really be kind of any any kind of feature. So for example, for an RDA entity, it could be things like content type or dimensions. It can really be any characteristic of that particular item you're cataloging. So what is an RDA entity? This is an abstract. It's completely an abstract term, but in the library reference model, because the library reference model is really meant to be not just directly tied to RDA, but it's meant to be a little bit more all-encompassing than just RDA. And it's meant to encompass like all of the RDA entities, but then it's also meant to be compatible with other, like other controlled vocabularies, other sort of frameworks that may be out there. So they wanted to make sure RDA fits in here someplace in the model, but at the same time, they don't want it to be at the top because we want to be able to be compatible with other data modelings that are out there. So, and the way they did it was to kind of slide RDA in as a separate spot, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So it's defined as being more narrow than the res, and the res is sort of the top category of all. And so it's not up there. It's not the top category, but it's going to be a little bit lower. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. So talking a little bit more about this terminology, because I think the terminology is a little bit challenging if you've not dealt with it before. An entity is just a thing with a characteristic. Characteristic as an attribute. For the purposes of the library reference model, for the purposes of how we think about um, entities, this can be material or physical things. It can be concepts. It can be imaginary things. So, all those things we kind of look at when we're thinking about what the subject may be. We have fictitious authors. Lassie writes a book, probably more than one. So, kind of thinking about all those things we deal with. So it includes all of that kind of stuff. And in this sort of hierarchy, and we're about to look at it in just a minute, but in this hierarchy, the res is the highest level thing. And thing in Latin means res. That's all it means. And when you have, and we're actually going to look at the whole model here in a minute, but this is my little snippet of a model. So we have res at the top, and we're just looking at the subcategories now that include the name authorities. So agent, agent is just where we're going to put all of our authorities. So at some point we may talk about agent, and that means authorities for us. And then of course we have person. So person is kind of here by themselves. And then we have collective agent, which is where we have our group people. So our families and our corporate body. And like I said, I think at some point corporate body, I won't be surprised to see that terminology flip to something else, because that to me seems like it's a really outdated term and does not fit with this. So this is just one little snippet of the hierarchy, and we're going to look at the hierarchy in just a minute. But an entity, um, any entity in the universe of discourse is kind of what res is. And the universe of discourse, of course, would be anything that we might get, collect, acquire, any of that kind of stuff. So you remember when you're talking about super and we're talking about sub, res would be a super class because it's going to be up there higher than agent and person and things like that. More new vocabulary. You're going to see this one too. And this one is I think it's a really confusing one, but this is nomen. And so the easy way to think about nomen is name. And by name, when you think about name, I don't mean like it could be a person's name, but we're thinking about really what we call something. And so that can be a subject, it could be a person's name, it could be the relationship of it. And we're going to look at some examples of this too. So res has the appellation of nomen. That's just the example they have. And basically that means all things have a name. And so remember, the entity is a thing with a characteristic. A characteristic is an attribute. And then res would be an entity because it is a thing, but it's going to be sort of the master thing, the thing above all things. It's probably the easiest way to remember it. And all things have a name. And thinking about what that really means, uh, we look at like a person's name, or we look at like a person. So like, what would be the name elements of a person? Well, the name elements of a person could be like their preferred name, it'd be their title. It could be the variant name of the person. I know we've talked a lot about variant names, but then on the data side of of it. That can be the authorized access point. It could be a variant access point. It could be that linked data URI that's going to point directly to that person's record or that person's data. So it's just a name or a title, but you're going to see that terminology throughout. FreeSAD, I thought, did a good job defining Gnomon. I wish they had put this definition in there because I think it's good. They defined it as any signed sequence of signs, and this can be, a symbol, it can be a sound, it can be alphanumeric, that a thema is known by, referred to, or addressed as. So for example, you have love, that's a subject. You have infinity expressed as an infinity symbol. And then we have a Dewey call number. When you're thinking about the LRM, really think about the subject relationships. So what they're looking at doing is from this, now remember, we're talking about the conceptual part of this. So we're getting kind of really conceptual with this, but we're talking about how a subject separates itself from what it is called. So what is my identity outside of my name? That is getting to that sense of what Gnomon is. What is my identity outside of that name? So here's an example. We're going to look at two of them. So here's an example. We're looking at Gnomon. So Gnomon to a person. So what is the relationship between a person and what they're called? And we have some examples here. We have Flanagan Terry. So that would be a text string. So that's what this person's called, but this is how we would express it in an authority record. And then, what is their role in can be their role specifically in terms of a particular work, illustrator or children's book. And then where are you getting the information about them? How are you determining how you're going to express or record that information from an authority file? So this is not something that we would sit and diagram every single thing we do. This is more of that process, that mental process that we do when we're cataloging. We just think about what is that person's name, what is their relationship, and then where are we getting that information for how do we record their name? We're going to get it from the authority file. We're going to get it from IMBD. We're going to get it from whatever our source is for authoritative information. Now, the other thing I want you to think about as we're looking at this kind of thing, think about each one of these as a relationship data point. So we could be linking to the URI for the authority record. We could be linking to some definition of Illustrator of children's books, or we could use Illustrator from our relator codes from that RDA vocabulary. Flanagan Terry, again, we can be linking to the authority file. So, that's sort of that, it's more of the thought process than it is the mechanics. Same sort of thing. Gnomon to subject, we have here virtual reality, and then where are you going to get that information from? The authority file. So just think about them as being representing a relationship. So it's a representational relationship. And then think about the data points and think about the linked data. So you're not going to be diagramming this when you're doing your cataloging work unless you're doing some kind of exercise or you're taking a quiz or maybe you're going to take my LRM class that I'm going to be doing in a couple of months, then you might diagram this stuff. Otherwise, you're just going to do your 650 if you're in a MARC record, and you're just going to do your 650 virtual reality. So what does this look like? I've teased you with what the hierarchy looks like for a while. So what does this look like? So again, you have your res at the top, and then you have on your second level, work, expression, manifestation, and item. And then we have our agent group here. And then if you look over here down below agent, we have our person and collective agent. We're actually missing family off here, aren't we? Um, well, there's a couple of things to note. So this was something that came out December 2017. There's been a lot of diagrams done since then. I've done my own diagram too. A couple of things I wanted to point out is that RDA entity would seem to go here because it is going to be less, it's going to be lower than res, but it has to be above work expression manifestation item. It has to be above authorities, and it has to be above subjects. So it seems like it would have to be in some place like this. Uh, of course, your work expression manifestation item, that's your WMI. And you'll notice here, and I think this is one of the things that gets a little bit confusing about the LRM, is that it clearly states that WMI is a hierarchy. Yet, these are all on the same tier, all on the same level. So I think that's a little bit confusing that they are all, rather than um, sort of being underneath each other in some ways. But it's also only 3 levels. So there's sort of the top level where res is kind of top, and then you have the second level, which is where all the WMI stuff would be. And so there's not really a way to kind of express that as more of a hierarchy within sort of this diagram approach. As I mentioned, collective agent would then be over here, would include corporate body and family. So it'd actually be one more level should they have one more level. And then you see here, nomen, place, and time span, and then event falls in there too. But this was sort of their first take at how they would put this together. And to just kind of show you sort of like what a hierarchy would kind of looks like, this is really the easiest one to see from this particular diagram. We're going to look at some more in just a second. Res, and then agent, and then we have person and collective agent, which collective agent is corporate body and families. This is my diagram. So res up here at the top, and then I put RDA here with the bibliographics. So I kind of put it in its own little spot. And then WMI, of course, WMI being its own little bucket, but its own little hierarchy. And then agent. So, agent, and then you have person and collective agent, and then family and corporate body. This structure right here is new. Then on the subject side, we have nomen, place, time span, and we also have event now. So how those would fit in together. So this is another example in terms of how things might look. This is from someone else from the same time period. But here is the WMI. WMI is created by agent, and then the subclass, or what category is that authority. It's a person, family, corporate body, and then here's where they have the RDA entity, and then they have your subjects over here. There's more connections that could go back from subjects to the other direction, but sort of a basic flow, which I think is good. So the IFLA LRM models the subject of works as a relationship. So we're looking more at all the connection points as a relationship. And I'm not going to read all of this, but it's from the LRM R12 and the LRM R30. So those are just the parts of the library reference model when you go look at it. So that's like the chapter citations. And then they say the FRAD affiliation of a person attribute implies membership, and so is modeled using the membership relationship. So everything is about relationships. An example of relationship, you have the title of the work. In an RDA, that was 4.2.1 back when they were putting chapter numbers in. And then in Ferber, it's giving you the citation there. It's more of a reference. And so what they're saying is that the title of the work is replaced by a relationship. So in terms of what we would record when we were cataloging, we would still record just the titles we've often done, but we would sort of mentally think about the title as a relationship, the title as a relationship to the author, title as a relationship to the subject, title as a relationship to other titles. So when I was talking about you could add those relationships to other works, there's getting right to that heart of it. So the basic Ferber relationship is retained, so that we've already talked about this and we've looked at some diagrams, but this is sort of snipping it out directly from the LRM. The basic Ferber relationship structure is retained, including those three primary relationship groups. So that would be your WIMI, oops, I missed a period, your WIMI, your authorities, and your subjects. So that's how those are all, that relationship's all still there. And so they've kind of defined it a little bit different. They have provided new relationships for responsibility for the creation and distribution and manifestation. So if you have something that is you're doing distribution, or you're doing some kind of modification of something that you get as modified, or something that you get as distributed by someone else, then there's some talk about how those particular works would be cataloged in terms of how we would talk about those relationships. So that so when I talk about, we're talking about new relationships in terms of those statement of responsibilities, to use some old terminology, but in terms of the creation, distribution, and then the modification. So how things are might be modified. And so right now they're looking at it sort of the item level. So if you have something that would be, maybe there's writing in the marginalia of particular work, there's someone's added some content to a work, or made notes, or added other information or something, that kind of thing. How do you record that kind of information? And so they're looking at that kind of stuff too. So I'm not really going to talk about this too much, but I do want to just kind of leave this with you as something to kind of think about, the other relationships Hamlet might have. And so, Hamlet has a relationship to places, people, and subjects, even outside the work itself. And so, if you were cataloging something that was like a biography of Hamlet, and so, sort of this fictional work of Hamlet, and, biography, there would be those elements that you could record about it, but then how would you, what other elements could you get to? You could certainly do a relationship to Hamlet the play. There might be other relationships you could do, but one of the things we're also starting to do is think about the relationships that not only our authors, but it could be subjects, it could be titles, have to other works, looking at kind of a larger body of work. So we talked about this already, just kind of revisiting and sort of reviewing it again, because this is sort of what you'll see in terms of what you'll be looking at. Oops, in terms of how things fit together. Seeing the hierarchy, this is just one little snippet of the hierarchy. Like I said, this is probably the hierarchy that's been most fully developed so far. WIMI is a hierarchy, although in the diagrams it does not look like a hierarchy, and we will look at another example. Here is an example of looking at sort of really breaking down the data parts of it. So we have here a work. So this is something that's, someone's cataloging. We have it, it's the subject, what's the subject? So has the subject of nomen. It's related to another work. It is how the creator's name's represented, what the title of the work is, what the access points are, the authorized access points, and then if there are variants of the title, a preferred title, things like that. So this is sort of that same process where we're looking at it. And where we're looking at these data points, we may have unstructured data points. So a preferred title of the work or a variant title of the work. So this would be like, if you have a work and there's like a uniform title, that kind of thing. So one would be unstructured data. That would be just information we're recording, but for our authorized access points, that would be more structured data. Or if we actually put identifiers, so if there is a URI for this particular work that we can use, or a URI for the author over here, we're just looking at the work relationship. So this would be sort of that thing that we're cataloging on our desk. or just sort of looking at the relationships it might have. So we have the relationship of the item we're cataloging to the author. And of course, then we would have another relationship kind of going the other way of the author to the work. And so thinking about sort of this larger sense of how, how those relationships happen and whether or not we can use an actual identifier, a uniform resource identifier that would link out so that we get to that linked data aspect. So subjects have, looking at subjects, really what we're looking at in the library reference model is sort of this bigger landscape. So we're really looking at how um, we're going to look at our landscape as a whole. So the WIMI model stays the same for Ferber, more or less. The authority model stays the same in terms of how we think about authority work, but the terminology changes and we have that hierarchy in place for our names. And then for our subjects, we also have this change in terms of how we think about things. So all of these things fall under this big category of res. And within that, we have pulled in, at least for the subjects, some of the attributes and like nomen, some of the things we've already talked about, but we also talk about and look at how res is a superclass, so how everything fits within that superclass. And really that gets to that sense of that hierarchy. So in subjects, we have nomen, which is an association between an entity and the designation that refers to it. So that can include just about everything. Place, a given extent of space, and then time span is also where we will see events slide in sometimes. And I think this is one of those areas we're still working out in terms of where we're going to fit things, because we do have time span associated with sort of an event that has a beginning and end in duration. And so that really falls very closely into where we would put events. Looking at a bigger, this is another landscape of kind of looking at the same thing. Res up here, and you see everything has an association with all these relationships. Here's our WIMI, our work expression manifestation item, and you see sort of all the relationships expressed here. And then, of course, we have agent, and then we have, the agent has created this particular work. We have that relationship between created, owns or modified, and then, agent being what kind of agent? Is it a person? So agent is a person, or is the agent a collective agent? And then, of course, collective agent we'd have down here family and corporate body. So is the agent one of those? And then we have here, of course, subject. And then we have really subject can kind of be a lot of things, but the subject being with the person, or of course we could have title as a subject. And then of course we have our time span and place. So the LRM merges those three functional requirements, the FRs, the FRAD, FERBER, and FREESAD. It focuses on relationships and links. It adds a new terminology, which is more semantic web oriented. Defines time span for subject analysis, and it defines place, but I would just say we redefine place. Nomen can kind of be really any topic, and then expands those Ferber user tasks. And why does it do that? Well, really because data's everywhere and users are everywhere, and it really is looking at that linked data. So what about our users? Well, they are everywhere, anytime, working with all kinds of formats. And one of the things that the LRM did was reevaluate those Ferber user tasks, which really is about the, at least the Ferber user tasks. The initial ones were about whether or not, a user can find what they're looking for and how our data can help. So we've talked about these before, but the find, identify, select, obtain, and the explore is the new one. So, can they find what they're looking for? Can they identify that identify it and distinguish between different types of things or maybe different formats of things? And then can they select what they is the most appropriate? Can they actually get it or access it? And then, of course, the last one is explore. So, can they find those related resources, that serendipity of experience? And so, this is the chart from the LRM that really breaks down exactly what they've done with each of the um, user task. And you'll see here, we call them the Ferber user task a lot of times because they find, identify, select, and obtain are all part of those Ferber unit user tasks. But then if you look at FRAD and you look at FreeSAD, there is some overlap between the two. So find and identify appears in FRAD. And then FreeSAD is the same thing, find, identify, select. So there is overlap between the three. And within IFLA, we keep find, identify, and select. And I think they've also simplified what that means in terms of can they find what they're looking for. And it really is focused on what we are doing. So, um, in Ferber, it was can they find entities that correspond to the user's stated search criteria, and they give you an example. And the definition under IFLA is to bring information about one or more resources of interest by searching on a relevant criteria. So I think they've really simplified the actual definitions, although we've sort of simplified the definitions a whole lot in terms of how we talk about these, but the formal official definitions have been very much simplified. In terms of obtain, the same sort of thing. In FRAD, there was a contextualize. So can, and the same thing in FreeSAD, there was sort of this notion of explore or conceptualize. Can they sort of see their relationships and figure out the relationships between various um, it could be people or it could be corporate body or whatever. Can they sort of essentially can they look at a person's name or at a corporate body and figure out the relationship? So can they see all a person's work or everything by a particular conference? So that was sort of the FRAD definition of that. Ferber didn't really cover that, like can they understand the data and find information that way? It didn't really cover that part of it. FreeSat actually covered this through in a way that I think makes a lot more sense of it, but it was through the relationships between subjects. So can they explore and find things related in subjects? So, that's one thing that was defined in FreeSat. And then in FRAD, we were like, can they find things by more things by the same person, that kind of thing. And so one of the things that IFLA did was they looked at those two and they realized that's something that we really didn't have in the Ferber user task. It ended with that bibliographic data. And so we didn't really explore, like talk about like how subjects work, whether or not they can find other things by subjects or related things, and then whether or not they can find other things by the same person. We just didn't cover those. And so they really then added, they liked the Explorer and they thought, well, we'll simplify the Explorer to discover resources using the relationships between them and thus place the resources in context. And I also think that is getting to that. I mean, I know they're talking about context, but I think that's also getting to that serendipity of experience and like browsing in the stacks. Because when you browse in the stacks, you do have a context. If you are looking at a particular collection, then you have the context of the collection that you're looking in. If you are looking by call number, just kind of like walk over 2 rows or, you know, look down a few shelves, you may not realize you have the context, but you have the context of the classification system that is tied to a particular subject heading typically. So you are getting the context even though you may not realize you're getting the context. So that serendipity of discoverability of what we do when we are browsing in the stacks or browsing a collection where we do have that contextual information placed around us. And I think it can go even one beyond that. So I think, online, the contextual experience that we can provide is another layer in addition to what we provide in terms of the structure of how things are organized on the set, the shelves, or maybe how things are um, whole number that's assigned to them, all that kind of stuff. The one thing they just did not like was the justify. And so the justify was really meant for us. So this was in the authority information, and they don't include it in the subject analysis, the subject FreeSat and all, but it was, can you document the authority date's reason, the authority data creator's reason for choosing the name or form of the name. So that really is about us. It's what none of our users would do that work probably. Some of them might, but for the most part, they just really wouldn't. I mean, that's just meant for us. Can we justify the name choice that we use? And so they just said, like, for a user task, that's just out of scope, which I think makes a lot of sense. So to wrap up here, where are we going? Well, data has given us a lot more options, and I think in all of our discussions throughout these last 4 weeks, we really have focused on kind of looking to the future and kind of talking about some of the current challenges and things like that. Data is much more mobile, social. We have so much digital data that's out there these days. There's a lot of good about that, and having personalized services through our data, being connected, things like that. The semantic web being able to pull together all the different kinds of resources from all different kinds of areas and kind of give them to us in different ways, as opposed to the sort of traditional web where it's a web of documents and we just kind of, you could read and maybe post, but you really couldn't do much with it. So kind of thinking more about that. And one of the things we're really starting to talk about finally, I think, is um, how we're going to move forward. And so, certainly RDA and I think the LRM sort of pushing us forward a little bit more, but certainly the um, RDA and Ferber and FRAD and FreeSAD, those early foundations, really we're kind of starting to look at like what direction we're going to go forward. Like how first it looked at like how do we do how should we be doing our work? What is the reason we do our work? What's our purpose? And then how should we model our data? The most basic fundamental levels, not like how do you code it or, what the title is, but, how do you actually model? What's the conceptual model for our data? And that was sort of that first take. And the second take is much more about aligning ourselves with more semantic web practices, also looking at linked data and starting to think more about that. Because so much of the semantic web stuff is already happening around us or starting to happen around us. And it's partially dependent upon the code, it's partially dependent upon the metadata and its metadata schemas, and then it's we have those two things already, although we may not like our mark formatting, but we've got mark formatting, we've got metadata, we've got rules that go with it. And, the other part of it then is the ability for the machines, including devices, to communicate, interpret data and to build those relationships and share data. And that's the part that we're hitting, I think, in terms of trying to figure out how it can happen. And I think there's a real awareness that we can move forward in our practices while still having a mark record for a little bit longer. We don't necessarily have to, as catalogers, change something in terms of not having a mark record. uh, I am seeing a lot more sort of ILS demos where they're not putting in the mark tags. They just list like title and author and or title and creator and number of pages or whatever. It just goes all the way down a list and you just kind of fill in a form. But the mark tags are behind it, but then the system turns it into XML. So the cataloger, I think some of our systems are already starting to hide the mark tags. So you're not actually seeing that because the system is going to just kind of create the mark record, or maybe not create a mark record. In some cases, they may just go to right to mark XML. So One of the things we're starting to think about is how we can use linked data to facilitate data sharing and quality, like how it can be a bridge to other resources, other schemas, other authoritative data resources. And so that linking process is part of the process that builds that relationship. And that's something that we can do. Of course, we're kind of stuck here. And what you may notice about this record is that there's nothing hot linked here. So even if we put in links, there's only a few places that we can put in links. And when you're talking about bib record, you're even more constrained in terms of where you've traditionally been able to put in links. But we are starting to think about how we can put links into records, both authority records and into bibliographic records, so that we can have a little bit more dynamic data and we can start doing some of that linked data work. So, how do we fit into this? Well, we are starting to align ourselves or realign ourselves a little bit more with modern data practices, and we're starting to uh, I think we're continuing down the path of providing cataloging that meets the needs of our users. So I think the Ferber user task, we're kind of going the next step. Like, how do we help them have that serendipity of experience, that contextual experience where they can find other related things, or maybe they want to go find other things completely unrelated. How do we facilitate that? And then, so we're starting to kind of I put together this little checklist, and I think it's pretty good. I mean, we've updated their cataloging rules so that they are more flexible and they are agnostic of metadata schemas. So RDA does not rely on MARC. Um, Most of us use RDA and MARC because that's kind of where we are. But if you're in a digital library using XML and Dublin Core, you can use RDA guidelines in those. We need to address digital objects better. I kind of call that one a done. We've done that. Updated view of authorities, and this is what I think is really interesting, is we're starting to talk about and think about identity management. So, we're thinking about identities in a different way. And we talked some about this in our previous classes where we're starting to think more about identity management. What does identity management mean? Um, how identity management for us is just more of that process of authorities. How do we take care of our authorized access points? How do we form our authorized access point? How do we think about the privacy and protection of our creators, all of that kind of stuff. So I say that's in progress because we're just starting to think about some of that stuff. Different format for our data that is more semantic web friendly, not MARC. We're working on it. BibFrame is coming along, and we'll talk about that in just a second, but it's starting to come along. And then capitalizing on other communities' data, practices, and data, and then to reuse shared data more than data entry. We're starting to experiment with this. There are projects. OCLC just did a project called Project Passages, where they were looking at working with Wikidata. And so that was a big project that just ended, I guess, at the beginning of the year or end of last year. So that was a big project to kind of look at how they can maybe use another community's authoritative data. And of course, BibFrame, we're just going to kind of finish up here with a general sort of looking forward. BibFrame really is looking to the future, and it's applying those Ferber models to bibliographic data. It does encourage linked data, so it's baked in. BibFrame 2 really sort of moved forward in terms of all of that. BibFrame focuses on the data structure and relationships of implementing RDA. And of course, RDA are our guidelines. So that's our guidelines for descriptive content. BibFrame also looks at breaking data into smaller bits. And I think one of the things that we really haven't explored, or at least many of us haven't explored or thought too much about, is how do we move away from a static flat record, a record that's just top to bottom, mark record kind of approach, to decentralized data with links or links to build relationships. Like, how do we break out of that static flat record? And, do we need an authority record and a bib record? Well, this might be one of those areas where Maybe we don't need it. BibFrame is not only looking at the LRM model, it's actually BibFrame 2 has embraced it. And of course, BibFrame can be expressed in MARC. You can express it in MARC or any other mini semantic web friendly formats. I just wanted to point out a couple of things. We won't spend too much time on BibFrame, but I just wanted to point out a couple of things. This is from the FAQs. Uh, it's looking at, instead of bundling everything neatly as a record and duplicating information across multiple records, BibFrame relies heavily on the relationships between resources. And so we've talked a lot about relationships, especially in this session with the LRM, but we're very much going down this road. The other thing, and this is getting to this linked data aspect of it. Actually, linked data is kind of here in two places. It manages this, so how does it keep from duplicating data? To share data across records. Using controlled identifiers for things, and there's that word things, people, places, languages, etc. MARC employs some of these ideas already using geographic codes, language codes, and things like that in a MARC record, but BibFrame seeks to make these aspects the norm rather than the exception. So how can you use controlled identifiers? Controlled identifiers meaning one term, or it could be um, a web address, one term for one thing, or one URL that goes directly to one thing. So it would be like in the name authority file, if you look at the Library of Congress web version, it would be that URL. Or if you go to the virtual internet authority file, the URL that goes directly to that person's entry. That would be that kind of thing. And then in short, BibFrame is looking at becoming the formal entry point into a larger web of data where links between things are paramount. So that is really the heart of it. And kind of, we've talked a little bit about linked data. We're starting to see some linked data. This is just an example, an early example, where basically anything that could be replaced. So New York, even the publisher, you could link to the publisher's website or to the publisher's name in some database, but anything you could actually link to where that link was unique, then you could do that. What we are starting to see is that for names and for subjects, we're starting to see links added to those uh, as a linked data entry point. So it will still have the subject heading, but if they can link out to a subject heading that matches completely with the subdivisions, then they'll add that link to it. And finally, just a little bit to kind of finish up here with BibFrame. BibFrame 2.0 does incorporate the languages of the LRM. So if you're looking at BibFrame 2.0 stuff, you will see that they have actually defined agents, subjects, and events. So they have actually defined that term, and the work instance and item actually maps to the WIMI model. So work, of course, at the top, an expression and manifestation, or in your instant, your item is kind of an easy one because it's down here. So they've kind of collapsed some of the information, but there's information on the BibFrame website about exactly how they map together. We've already talked a little bit about this, but there is a PCC URI task group, and this is really where we're starting to look at the linked data aspect of where we can put those records, those fields into records. And so subfield 0 and subfield 1 have been identified as potential places where you can put a URI. And a subfield 0 is for authorities, which means that it's from the PCC, actually has a list where they've identified authorities. So Library of Congress, subject headings, names, that kind of thing. And then subfield 1 is for other things. So they really are looking at URIs that identify a record or authority entity describing a thing. So this would be one thing, or so it can be like the person's name, something like that, or it can directly identify a thing itself. And then things, in this sense, when we're calling them things, this is also something that's called a real world object. And this is something we're just now starting to talk about in terms of what we can link to in a MARC record. So this is a very specific MARC information in terms of how we can do this. And this is what I was talking about in terms of the subject headings and the names that we could actually link to those records now. Subfield 0 if it's an authoritative resource, subfield 1 if it's just something else. This can be a transition point to link data because we would have that linking field there. And at some point we might even lose the other part of it and just keep the link, or um, you know, there's some other process that may happen. And on that note, we kind of looked forward a little bit in terms of linked data. I hope you have enjoyed this class. I've enjoyed all of the discussion and all of the work that everyone's done. And I hope you continue to think more about controlled vocabularies and also check out my upcoming classes because I will be teaching a lot more for Library Juice. On that note, thank you, and I hope to see you again soon.